Great. I think, can we get started? Yeah. Well, thank you all. We're really excited about our second panel with our distinguished speakers this morning. It's my pleasure to start us off on this session where we'll be considering threats to democracy, election infrastructure, and election officials. We had a little bit of discussion about this earlier on the first panel, and so I'm really looking forward to developing out the conversation much more. So first, my name is Ranjana Natarajan. I'm going to be moderating this panel. I'm going to give a quick introduction of all of our terrific panelists, and then we're going to start off a conversation and go from there. And then we'll try to save some time at the end for audience questions as well, just as with the last panel. So let me introduce my speakers. To my immediate right is Secretary Jena Griswold from the great state of Colorado. Secretary Griswold is the 39th Colorado Secretary of State. She is just the 10th woman to be elected to constitutional statewide office in state history and is the youngest elected Secretary of State in the United States. Prior to being elected Secretary Griswold practiced international anti-corruption law and worked as a voter protection attorney. She also served as the director of the Governor of Colorado's DC office, advocating on behalf of Coloradans in DC. She's overseen 6 statewide elections, and during that time, her office has launched a statewide system so every voter can track their ballot, increased mail ballot drop boxes by 65%, and passed automatic voter registration, registering more than 350,000 eligible Coloradans. Under her leadership, Colorado has been recognized as a trailblazer when it comes to voter access and election security, making it a gold standard among the states. To her right is McCord. Mary is the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, or ICAP, and a visiting professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Prior to that, Mary was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the U.S. Department of Justice for 2016-2017, and the principal deputy assistant attorney general for national security from 2014 to 2016. She was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years here at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia. Welcome, Mary. To Mary's right is Rachel Orey. Rachel is the associate director of the Bipartisan Policy Center Elections Project. They focus on policy development and state and federal advocacy relating to elections administration. Prior to this, they supported research of the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program on elections and a wide variety of other matters. And finally, to their right is Praetz. Noah is a co-founder of the Elections Group, where he consults with state and local election officials, as well as the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency that we know as CISA. Previously, he ran elections in Cook County, Illinois, where for 20 years, he was responsible for election administration in one of the largest election jurisdictions in the country. He's also an adjunct professor at DePaul University College of Law, teaching election law, and a part-time lecturer at the University of Chicago, where he teaches cyber policy. We have a lot of underachievers on the panel today. I am with the States United Democracy Center. We support pro-democracy state and local officials around the country to safeguard our democracy. We provide legal, research, communications, and other support to state officials. And in addition to election protection, we work on countering disinformation and preventing political violence, and finally, making sure that democracy violators are held accountable. Thank you all for joining us this morning. So I think I'd like to start us off with maybe picking up from what we just discussed in the first panel. We had threats-wise and intimidation-wise and violence-wise, we had a relatively safe election, thank goodness. Many of us in this room and elsewhere around the country worked very hard to get to that point. That being said, we know that threats still exist and the threat landscape is getting more intense as we head toward the presidential election in 2024. So let's start with talking about some of the strategies that worked, some of the things we saw on the ground, and some lessons learned as we move forward. Mary, can I start with you?
Sure. So I think many of us did breathe something of a sigh of relief that we did not see more violence, intimidation, threats, harassment on Election Day, and certainly after Election Day when the ballots were being counted. And I think there's several things that contribute to this. One, is I think the power of the litigation that was brought before Election Day to challenge voter intimidation efforts at ballot drop boxes. We saw this in Arizona in particular, where there were court cases brought challenging the initiative of the Clean Elections group to have surveillance of ballot drop boxes, and this was done in a way that was very intimidating to those who were seeking to use those drop boxes. It involved video surveillance, it involved armed individuals coming and staking out the ballot drop boxes. The judge in that case did ultimately issue an injunction preventing this type of intimidation and preventing anyone from being armed within 250 feet of a ballot drop box. I think that litigation right before the election sort of sent this message, right? Like, there are people watching and taking really serious efforts to intimidate. I think it's also important that DOJ was in the House. DOJ filed, unlike in 2020, DOJ filed a persuasive brief in one of those cases in Arizona and made clear it was sending out more election observers than it had in past years, and I think that it was significant. We also saw efforts elsewhere. Seattle, for example, took down misleading signage outside ballot drop boxes, signage that falsely said the drop boxes were under surveillance, that it would be a felony to deposit more a ballot beyond your own, when in Washington state it is not illegal to deposit ballots for others. It's not illegal under US law. So I think sort of those efforts were important. That's one thing. Another thing is I think that the media and so many people in this room did a good job, maybe even a better job this year than in 2020 in really getting the word out about what the law is. Many organizations such as my own at ICAP, States United, and others put out a lot of guidance, right? A lot of guidance about armed paramilitary groups are not lawful in any state and they have no authority to go guard polling places against voter fraud, put out guidance about voter intimidation, what it is. Threats are unlawful in every state. That kind of word got out, and the media reported about these things. I think that meant many things. That meant members of the public were more aware of their rights, more aware of what was legal and not legal, and more inclined to report things that they felt were intimidating and harassing. It meant law enforcement also had a better understanding of the law. And groups like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, major city chiefs, and other organizations of law enforcement and public officials brought people like me and others to speak about the laws and really give them that sort of legal backup they needed to feel confident going out there and making public statements in advance of the election that things wouldn't be tolerated. Many people like Larry Krasner, the elected district attorney in Philadelphia, had a press conference before the election and said, we're going to be on the lookout for voter intimidation and we will prosecute it. And we have a whole staff of attorneys to do that. And then the last thing I'll mention, there are other factors that I'm sure others will mention, is, most of the election deniers for the statewide offices and federal congressional offices, most lost and most actually conceded. And I cannot tell you how significant I think that is, because even though we still have Kari Lake in Arizona who's contesting the election, and even though many election deniers won at the lower levels, like state legislative levels and things like that, which is a whole nother issue we can talk about because that presents a threat going forward. But at that statewide level, many lost and they conceded. And I work with a lot of researchers who monitor the online extremist environment. And even though there was lots of agitation and talk about violence and taking things into their own hands, they were really waiting for like a directive in many ways. And I think, former President Trump tried a few times. He said like protest, 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 and he did some things like that. But he never, he did not have people in so many different states also calling for some type of people taking things into their own hands. And that was in many ways, I think, because people actually conceded. So I don't think we're in the clear there, but I think that was very, very important. And Trump not having the same reach as he did in 2020. I mean, even though I know Elon Musk has allowed him back on Twitter, so far he hasn't gone back on Twitter, and that happened after the election at any rate. So we'll see, and we'll talk more about going forward.
Thanks, Mary. Secretary Griswold, from your vantage point in office, perhaps you can give us some perspective on this election and the threats we've seen.
Sure. And I think there's two things. First off, thank you to you and many people in this room. Just a month ago, I think a lot of us understood that the United States could largely lose democracy. There were election deniers running in Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico. Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, Secretary of State of New Mexico, is here. Not the election denier. There was election deniers running in Nevada, in Arizona. And I think, number one, the thing that should be celebrated is that American voters care deeply about this country. They understand the stakes. And we beat election deniers running for Secretary of State in every battleground state in the United States. And that's something we should all just highly commend, because this panel would look very differently had we have lost those races. And some of them, frankly, were close. Nevada was very close. We saw in many states the Secretary of State candidate run above where the gubernatorial and other top of the tickets were. Again, shows Americans care about democracy. You know, I grew up in a cabin in rural Colorado with an outhouse outside on food stamps. And I think going into the last election, a lot of the national pundits were saying, Americans cannot think about the rising cost of inflation, the rising cost of paying your bills and democracy. That is untrue. So we got through 2022, but we're here to talk because we know that the attack on democracy is not over. The former president, one of the leading political leaders in this country, one of the leading political leaders in the Republican Party, just said we should terminate the Constitution. We have been under a coordinated effort to dismantle democracy for elections over the last several years, to say the least. It includes the voter suppression bills that have passed across the nation. It includes threats to election infrastructure. For example, I had to address the first insider threat where an elected county clerk actually compromised her own voting equipment trying to prove the big lie. We're seeing threats to election workers. You all know the story. At this point, we have a county working behind bulletproof glass. I have security with me when I'm out in public. We've also seen, of course, I guess I can't say that word today, but the increased political violence, the rhetoric of violence, and it's leading to real effects. So I think, you know, moving forward, we, number one, have to recognize that the attack on democracy is not over. It is very likely to intensify over the next 2 years. We also have to recognize that we can win this battle against those trying to use lies to steal power. This is all about power. And there's several things that we have to do. Number one, states have to strengthen their laws immediately. And I would love to talk about how Colorado has been a leading force on that, whether it's making it a felony to compromise voting equipment. We made it illegal to dox or retaliate against election workers. Just this year, we prohibited open carry within 100 feet of voting or ballot processing. We've also been very aggressive in prosecution in the state of Colorado. We need to strengthen state laws. We need the federal government to step up immediately. And I know there's a bifurcated Congress right now, but there is things that the federal government needs to do. We need to see the DOJ act, because folks are incentivized right now to destroy for their own political gain. And I think it's good to see some of the work that the DOJ has done over the last year. It needs to be strengthened immediately. And number four, we cannot stop talking about democracy. I know this sounds corny, but I actually believe the Washington Post byline, democracy dies in darkness. And we cannot allow ourselves or the American people to just get sick about talking about this continued attack on democracy, because it's going to happen over the next 2 years. We have to beat election deniers. We have to beat threats against democracy to make sure that every eligible person in this country can have their voice heard, and that the people get to choose the President of the United States. That's what all of this is about. And I am so optimistic we're going to get that done over the next 2 years and into the future.
Thank you. Rachel? Thank you so much. In terms of thinking about the threats that our democracy faced this midterm election, I think that, like many of you, I was preparing for the worst. Everything from widespread certification challenges to outright violence. And I definitely second everything that Mary and Jena shared about the importance of litigation, of strengthening state laws to prosecute, investigate those threatening or harassing election workers. But for the most part, what I see as a big success was the vigilance and coordination that everyone in this room took part in to make sure that we were as strong as possible going into the midterm election to prevent potential threats. And yet, as we as a nation potentially breathe a sigh of relief, my biggest concern for 2023 is that we do get tired of talking about threats to elections, and we kind of turn a blind eye to our state and local election administrators who have been shouldering American democracy through an incredibly tumultuous period. Ask any kind of state or local election official who has been working for the last couple years, and their jobs are getting harder, they're getting more complicated, they're coming at the expense of their own personal well-being and at times physical safety. And in terms of what worked to convince voters that this election could be trusted, many election officials were putting in their own personal time and resources, inviting election deniers into their own offices at times at risk of their personal safety, spending more and more of their hours walking voters through the most mundane parts of the election process, trying to show that the election can be trusted in response to these conspiracy theories that have no basis in reality. I think we all saw the story about Haidar Garcia, a county election official in Texas, who has been spending his days welcoming voters into his office to show them how the process works. Tammy Smith, who is a member of our task force on elections, I believe she's in the room today. She's the county election administrator in Wilson County, Tennessee. Just this week before coming, she held a huge Christmas party for all of her poll workers out of her own pocket, really to embolden or strengthen that kind of civic spirit in her community. And so really we have these folks to thank, but when it's at the expense of their own resources, when they're spending all of their time trying to push back against conspiracy theories and threats, they have less time to serve voters. So if we don't strengthen our support at the state and federal level through increased resources, we run the risk of not being able to reach voters where they are, not being able to support elections as we might otherwise be able to. So my biggest takeaway going into the next year is to not lose sight of what it is that brought us together and not lose sight of the importance of democracy in our country.
Thanks. Noah?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate all of your comments, and particularly the opening comments by the founder, when he just brought up the Tocqueville, right, and discussed the ship of state. And there's no question, we're bobbing about in a stormy, tumultuous time. He discussed elections as being ballast. I think that's true, but what's really at the core of that ballast are local election officials, primarily, and they're under the gun. So to the extent that we take some lessons from this election, I don't think the lesson is the storm has passed. I think the lesson, is with reinforcement that they got from government, that they got from their secretaries of state, that they got from the broader NGO community. They were able to weather the waves. But I don't believe the storm has passed. I think the ship is actually quite damaged. I mean, you brought up the stories from a lot of local election officials. I'm just gonna read a tweet from one of them in Massachusetts. She says, "It's not just the stress, not just the long hours with no overtime, not just the harassment, not just the death threats, the cybersecurity threats, not just staying calm in the face of all of it. It's all these things combined." Now, for her part, she says she's still in. I'm not sure that that's going to be the case for most of our workforce. The truth is we're demanding way too much from them without enough support. And so I think we draw the lesson that what we did was shore up the ship as a broad ecosystem, but now is the time to double down the same efforts, right? Increase that resourcing and that support so that the ballast is firm going into 24 and beyond.
I want to turn to one of the core lessons I think we've learned in this work, which is that security really depends on engagement and connectivity between law enforcement as a critical partner and local and state and election officials and others. But law enforcement has been really critical to engage and also to educate, frankly, on the operational planning around elections. And where that has worked, it has proven tremendously valuable for election security and safety. So in our work, for example, we found that really just getting on the ground with local law enforcement and local election officials, making sure that their connections are deep, that they're talking to each other throughout the election season and not just sort of a week or two before the election, can be really important. I'd like each of you to reflect on law enforcement. Secretary Griswold, you sort of alluded to some of the protections in Colorado law that were recently put into place, and that's just one example. But I'd love to hear more about what you think we can continue to do and do even better in terms of bringing law enforcement and election officials together. So if you don't mind, I'll just start with you and we'll go down the...
Sure, and those series of laws we passed this year, you know, it was number one, the first law in the nation on insider threats. So the Colorado Election Security Act, my office and I led into law, makes it a felony to compromise voting equipment. It is now a felony to access or allow unauthorized access to voting equipment. We put whistleblower protections into the law. There's upgrades of all election equipment in the state of Colorado. All voting equipment will be behind badge-in access, not 24/7 video just around the election season, year-round. So we really fortified the entire process and made it clear that you cannot compromise voting equipment in the state of Colorado to try to prove your wacky conspiracies. We're not going to do that. Like I mentioned, we made it a crime to threaten or dox election workers. I unfortunately had to pass a law largely for the Secretary of State to be able to get state patrol. Just in the last 3 months, I've had over 500 threats for doing my job. We banned that open carry. In 2020, we did have 2 men in military gear open carrying, filming voters as they dropped off ballots in one of our counties. And I'll tell you, we were able to pass those laws not because law enforcement demanded it, but because I demanded it. Because we said we are going to make sure we're going into this election as strong as possible. What my office did ahead of 2020, what we did again ahead of 2022 is think about if I wanted to disrupt voting, if I wanted to undermine confidence, what would I do? What would I do? And then because we have a legislature very willing to work with us, we tighten our laws every single year ahead of those evolving threats. Anything that we can think about, we patch up our laws. So for example, what's happening in Arizona, where folks are refusing to sign off on the election, we fixed that in Colorado state law this year, anticipating that that process could happen. We've seen it a couple times across the nation. In terms of law enforcement, you know, with local matters, it really depends on what jurisdiction you're in, and it's problematic. In Mesa County, if you guys are familiar with the saga of County Clerk Tina Peters, who worked with QAnon and the My Pillow guy to try to prove the big lie, she compromised her voting equipment. She's under prosecution right now. There is a great district attorney. And when my civil servants went in to investigate the voting equipment, they went in as the Republican district attorney executed search warrants. He's been leading the prosecution there. But there are some counties where local law enforcement or the elected district attorneys are not all that interested in election-related offenses. So my office, to your point, has been working with prosecutors across the state of Colorado to make sure that they know the evolving law landscape. We work with sheriffs and other law enforcement to make sure that folks know, well, there are specific crimes related to elections. But then also we lean in. We've leaned in to the DOJ, you know, having to talk publicly about the threats against election workers. It gets really hard to do your job when people are saying they're going to come kill you on a nearly daily basis. So we've leaned into the DOJ. We're really happy to see those prosecutions start. We lean into local law enforcement also. In our statewide primary, we allegedly had someone in Pueblo, a voter, try to compromise voting equipment while they voted. So they were using a piece of voting equipment, and we believe they tried to put a USB into the voting equipment. The voting equipment did exactly what it was supposed to do. It shut down. And then I have a rule in place where election workers have to actually go sanitize. It's a COVID rule. Go sanitize voting equipment in between every single use. The voting equipment shut down. The election worker pulled it out of use immediately. But things like that. We work with local law enforcement so that they understand. This isn't just tampering with state property. Tampering with election voting equipment is an attempt largely to undermine American democracy. We have to be very strong, make sure our laws are ready to go, and we really need prosecutors to prosecute, again, to disincentivize this really bad behavior, not against the state of Colorado or a piece of voting equipment, but against the American people's ability to have free and fair elections. Thanks.
So law enforcement, I think, can be, one of the best partners in protecting elections, but it also can be a problem. We experienced, I mentioned, the U.S. Conference of Mayors bringing together major city chiefs. We had sheriff's associations, other police associations, very engaged early on in getting briefings about the threats, getting briefings about the particular laws that they could enforce. And encouraging them to meet early with their local officials, the election officials, mayors, local police, and community groups, right? Not just a bunch of government people, community groups to figure out what is going to work in each community. In one community, a law enforcement presence at the polls to show we're not going to allow voter intimidation might be really welcomed by the community. In other communities, it might make things 100 times worse because in some communities, a law enforcement presence is itself intimidating. And that has got to be not one size fits all, right? That has got to be individual, location by location. But it's up to the government leaders and the community to come together and figure that out in advance. There's a bad side to law enforcement too. I've worked with law enforcement all my life. I have enormous respect for the men and women in our law enforcement, but there are bad actors in law enforcement. And unfortunately, even though I think that is a minority, they have an outsized impact when it comes on trust between communities and the law enforcement who is supposed to be serving them. And I heard when I was in government and I hear outside of government, time and time again about, particularly from community groups, voting rights groups, activist groups, that they just don't trust law enforcement. Well, you cannot safely protect our elections, much less democracy, if we can't kind of bridge that trust deficit. And one of the things that means is that law enforcement needs to take seriously eradicating extremists from its ranks. You will sometimes hear, oh, well, police have First Amendment rights and we can't discipline somebody because, they're racist or they espouse QAnon or they, are anti-LGBTQ. Well, that's actually not true. The First Amendment does give significant leeway to discipline, including firing or refusing to hire law enforcement who engage in extremist activity, even when they're speaking in their personal capacity, not, with their uniform on, even in their personal capacity, speaking on a matter of public interest. If their speech is so extremist that it undermines the mission of law enforcement, makes them less effective or efficient, that can be disciplined. And there's case after case after case across the country upholding that, even in the face of First Amendment rights. So yes, police officers have First Amendment rights, but they're not unlimited. And so one of the things States United and ICAP have done together is put out guidance on this and talk with law enforcement. And it's one thing that, we've also said, we're a litigating shop. We will back up a law enforcement agency that takes action. I can tell you right now, their own attorneys are going to be like, oh, no, don't fire that person because we'll get sued. Well, maybe don't talk to your own attorneys for a minute. Maybe talk to the people who are willing to defend you, right? Because they're risk averse. I mean, if I were their general counsel, I'd also say, oh, let's not be sued. But that's not the only way to look at it. So I think, again, law enforcement, it's complicated. It can be great, but they can also be a problem. I want to just say one more thing, because Jena mentioned if I were going to try to, attack an election, what would I do? I think, and maybe this is not the right time for this answer, but maybe we can talk about it later. I don't know how many of you, probably everyone, heard about what just happened in Moore, North Carolina over the weekend, where basically the electrical grid for the area was taken out by what we have to assume are extremists. I don't think we know yet who did it, and if we do, I haven't seen that news yet, who wanted to make sure there was no power for an LGBTQ event that was planned. Well, that took out power for a whole lot of people for a long time. That's the kind of sabotage that can also impact an election. Imagine if you saw that type of activity in any jurisdiction in the country, you know, right on the eve of election day. It could mean the machines don't work, it could mean the lights aren't on, right? So we have to, you know, I think what Jena has said is exactly right. You have to think about and plan for, and law enforcement has to plan for, and our cybersecurity officials have to plan for, and secretaries of states have to plan for what happens if there's that kind of an attack.
And to jump in really fast, I can speak for the state of Colorado. We have plans for all of that. Prior to 2020, we had plans for all types of things that you normally think could happen. Grid failure, cyber attack, I won't go through them all. And then we started to think about the political aspects. Well, what happens if the National Guard is federalized and shows up to drop boxes? What happens if Homeland Security or whoever from federal government seizes voting equipment? What happens if all the things that folks have been saying over the last 2 years actually happen? So planning now is a whole different type of thing in election administration, because you have to think of you know, the natural incident plannings, but then add in all these crazy scenarios that we wouldn't have imagined could be mainstreamed 4 years ago.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief, but I have 3 things to pick up on both of their comments. So rich, and so at a high level first, Jena mentioned that, you know, Colorado has plans for all of these different contingencies, and you know, state and local election officials are the best contingency planners I have ever met. But at the same time, making all of those plans, implementing those plans takes resources. I think we've all heard about the printer issues in Maricopa County on Election Day. Those were pretty minor and run-of-the-mill problems. They were addressed and they were, you know, quickly solved. All voters could still cast their ballots. And yet it became this big fodder for election conspiracy theories. And so we see that if more and more election offices' resources are being dedicated toward these fringe contingency plans we now have to do because of mistruths about our election that are taking hold, it makes it harder to respond well when small issues happen. And then you know, it compounds and it increases the risk that these kind of fraud conspiracies take hold. On the issue of law enforcement specifically, it is a fine line when law enforcement is involved in elections for all of the reasons that Mary mentioned. But there are 2 specific trends that I've been seeing that have been quite alarming. One is the criminalization of election administration that we've been seeing take hold in state legislatures around the country. We have seen election police forces crop up. We've seen it you know, become unlawful or a felony to send a mail ballot application to a voter who hasn't requested one. We've seen all kinds of small election administration mistakes be criminalized in a way that makes election officials a scapegoat for election fraud ideas, which is unfair when election officials have been the ones that are getting us through this period. When we need to be supporting and investing in those folks, we've instead seen this kind of counter trend of holding them at fault for things that they have not done wrong. So I would encourage states to, you know, shift that course in 2023 and really support election administrators when they need it most. Finally, we have seen, as Jena mentioned, she has had 500 threats this month. That is par for the course across the country. Recent surveys have shown that 1 in 4 state and local election officials have received threats, harassment, or abuse in their roles in the past 2 years. This is not acceptable in a healthy democracy. And most of the field has coalesced around the idea that we need to increase prosecution to solve this problem. And that is absolutely true. But I like to take a yes and approach. I don't think prosecution alone is going to mitigate the likelihood of these threats happening. They might to some degree, but I think we also need to look at the underbelly of discontent that is making these happen in the first place. They don't happen in a healthy democracy. I think that there are fractures in our political culture that we need to look at as a community, and it's not just elections, right? If people are struggling financially, if people can't afford to send their children to daycare, if they're distrustful of Congress, if it's not working right, these are the kinds of things that all compound on each other. So I hope that moving forward we can take a more ecosystem level view on what is driving this kind of extremist trend in American culture.
There's a lot of sort of powerful themes in there, things that sort of impact the way we approach our relationships. There are 10,000 election officials, okay? And if their power goes out or they get a threat, they're not calling their legislators, they're not calling BPC or the elections group, they're not calling the secretary, they're calling their police. It's an institution that's fundamental to the safety and security of voters, of election officials, of the process. There are bad actors. Yes, there are bad actors in elections. That doesn't get beyond the point that we need to build those relationships. So to the point about building trust within communities, it's really important to establish different ground rules. So there's a group called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, a cross-partisan group of law enforcement officers, election officials, current and former, working together to help provide resourcing to election officials and law enforcement. It's supported by nonpartisan groups, us, the elections group, along with R Street, Protect Democracy, the Brennan Center, trying to enable and facilitate relationship sharing. At the core is meet your counterpart in law enforcement, okay? Share details about your experience, your expectations of them, okay? Agree on ground rules, set those red lines. Like, we don't want to see you in uniform around voters unless you get called in, but we need you to be in enhanced readiness. But at the ballot processing center, come in force, okay? Plan for that relationship development and practice it. You all saw in Maricopa how that really mature relationship can be put into place to, one, diffuse or put defenses up from what could otherwise be really challenging situations around ballot counting. But what we know from watching that relationship develop is their first few meetings were about election integrity. Hey, sheriffs, law enforcement, these are all the checks in elections. This is why it's a trustworthy process. Okay? There are downstream benefits from collaborating with this group of folks who otherwise, many of whom, friends of mine included, are skeptical about elections in our democracy. That's a very important relationship to build. We saw it in northern Utah, okay, where a clerk there brought 8 counties together, law enforcement officials, DAs, election officials, to start this discussion. A lot of that time was spent on why elections are secure. That was sort of a threshold question to the relationship build. And then they went on to talk about what the expectations are for your support. I think keeping our institutions tied at the hip, right, in government generally, is very critical to our country at this point. So the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections is working in that vein to support this relationship building. It's safeelections.org. I would encourage you to take a look at that.
Thank you. I have been cataloging a list of all the threats while we've been having a conversation. So not to be a downer, but I think it's worth just reminding ourselves that the threats are enormous and they're multivarious. And we haven't even talked about militias or this so-called constitutional sheriffs movement that we're seeing around the country and other very specific and dangerous threats like that. So I'll save my list for the end, but I think that we all, at least as a panel and probably in this room, agree the threats continue. They're going to intensify as we get toward the 2024 presidential election and the stakes get high, not to mention some actors who have used threats and intimidation for their own benefit in the past are coming back on the scene in a big way. So I think we've identified some strategies so far. And I think one big question is, how do we make sure people generally are on the alert that we are not sort of, screaming into the darkness about this, because it might be a good 15 months, hopefully never, but it might be a good 15 months before we see threats or violence of the type that we were all sort of prepared for after January 6th. So what can we do to make sure people understand that even if there are sort of some lone wolf figures, or even if there are some nascent movements, this is not going away, and it's going to get worse before 2024. How do we keep our eye on that ball? Communications, messaging, tracking disinformation trends seem all really important to me, but I'd love to hear what you all think about other strategies, real specific ones.
Sure. Well, I think it's really important to continue to communicate. But before we get into, well, how do we make sure that we are ready to go to counter disinformation, and that the media knows what's going on, American voters need to know what's going on. The one thing that we haven't talked about is that one of the massive threats against democracy is the voter suppression bills being passed across this country. You guys turn on the news today. Before coming over, I was watching CNN, and there was a voter in Fulton County saying how she had a disabled son and had an absentee ballot, and she went to the polling place where she was told to go to and was turned away. That is an attack against democracy. That is one of the easiest attacks against democracy, is put such bad laws in place that it becomes so hard for working people to cast ballots in this country, for some people to cast ballots in this country. So we have to continue to speak up against the voter suppression, because we are seeing it in real time in this nation, that some elected officials don't want some of their voters to cast a ballot. Now, when it comes to the larger threats to the disinformation, I've been very proud of Colorado's leadership. Leading up to 2020, I established the first unit in the country in a Secretary of State's office to combat foreign disinformation. We set up our own tracking about what Russia, Iran, China was pumping into Colorado, and at some points alerted states before DHS did. For example, about Sharpiegate, if you guys all remember Sharpiegate from 2020. We also started PSAs, paid PSAs out to every voter, Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated, to alert them of the role of foreign disinformation. Several of the lessons we learned from Russia's interference in 2016 is that some of the best strategies is just readiness. Americans need to know that they are subject to disinformation, often very sophisticated. Folks like my mom, who still lives up in rural Colorado in that cabin, needs to know that her neighbor up the mountain, just because they post something about elections and she knows her neighbor, well, that could be Russian propaganda. And unfortunately now, it could be domestic propaganda. So we've continued those efforts. Just this year, I was actually joined by my predecessor, former Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, in a PSA to alert Coloradans about disinformation and how to go to a trusted source. And to be very clear, former Secretary of State Wayne Williams, a Republican, was my opponent in 2018. Not only has he accepted 2 appointments to intercede in Mesa County, I appointed him in Mesa County 2 times, he then joined me in a bipartisan PSA. That doesn't mean that he didn't endorse my opponent this election cycle, nor did I expect him not to endorse. But I bring this up because that's how American politics should work. Republicans and Democrats should be able to run against each other and then put it all aside and do what's good for the country. That's what we should see across this nation. But I'll tell you, one of the things that the panel has brought up is that little missteps suddenly fuel massive disinformation. Election administration is tremendously hard. A little issue that in 2016 probably wouldn't even get a newspaper article now gets national media, and then a week later it turns into death threats. That's what election administration is in this country right now. So I think states need to continue to push out PSAs. It's not without political peril. You get pushed back on very hard when you put out PSAs. But if we don't alert our citizens, who will? If we don't talk about the disinformation they're seeing on social media, who will? We also really need support. I'll tell you, being a Secretary of State largely feels that you're fighting all these battles by yourself. Folks 2 years ago, other elected officials did not know or understand what we were grappling with. The only folks who really understood what you were grappling with are other secretaries of state, are other election workers. But we need to continue to encourage election administrators to have a strong spine, to stand up to threats, and to make sure that they're doing the right thing, putting politics aside, putting the political hits aside, putting what is going to come in threats aside, and just continuing to lead in the best way that they think they should.
So early on, I alluded to this idea that, the fact that actually a lot of election deniers won in 2022. They did not win the statewide races. They did not win all of the congressional races. But they won pretty overwhelmingly at the state legislative level and other sort of local levels, many times because they weren't even opposed, frankly, or because a county was so politically entrenched in one way or another that there was no chance of their opponent winning. So we have to think, when we're starting to think about what are the threats going forward, I don't know how many of you in this room are aware that tomorrow the Supreme Court will hear argument in a case called Moore v. Harper. This is a political gerrymandering case out in North Carolina. And the theory of the legislature there, who's appealed this to the Supreme Court, is that the state legislature, by virtue of the Elections Clause of the US Constitution, the Elections Clause does give the state legislature the power to choose the manner of choosing senators and representatives. Manner includes redistricting, right, every 10 years. And the argument is that that constitutional provision means that the state legislature can essentially politically gerrymander all they want, and it would not be subject to review by state courts for compliance with state constitutions. Now, you may or may not know, the Supreme Court has already held that the federal government does not prohibit partisan gerrymandering. There's no, according to the court, no administrable standards or guidance under the US Constitution. And the Supreme Court has also told us, you know what, state constitutions can provide that guidance and standard. And the court told us that just a couple of years ago. Yet nevertheless, the court is hearing argument tomorrow about whether or not actually we can look to state constitutions to rein in political gerrymander. Why do I say all this when we're talking about threats of future? Imagine this, election deniers are in those state legislatures, right? Broad view of independent state legislature gives them power potentially to redistrict in ways that would entrench one-party rule in states, including particularly in swing states where you might otherwise expect it kind of go back and forth over the course of time. One legislature could entrench one-party rule for decades. We also have a clause in the Constitution called the Electors Clause, which gives state legislature the ability to determine the choosing of presidential electors. So a broad view, again, of this independent state legislature theory, and I say theory because it's a theory, would essentially give those legislators even potentially the ability to overrule a popular vote after it has occurred. Now, as a litigator, we would challenge that on federal due process grounds, et cetera, et cetera. We'd go probably all the way to the Supreme Court on that. But the point is, it can open the door for a whole lot of meddling. So even as we need to continue to be concerned about sort of physical threats of violence, intimidation, harassment, voter intimidation, we also have this pernicious legal theory working its way through the courts, and we know that at least 3 justices are at least somewhat inclined toward this broad view of the independent state legislature theory. So it makes it even all the more important to make sure at our local level, those races and our state legislative races, right, that we are, again, you know, really supporting candidates of either party who don't just deny elections, right, who have respect for our democracy and its processes. And then the last thing I'll say, switching gears, is we know post-January 6th, and I don't know if this will change post-midterms, but we know post-January 6th, the strategy of extremists became very decentralized and localized, right? County over country. capture your county, maybe a few, then take over your state. And we saw that happening in this last almost 2 years, you know, with county boards being overtaken by like paramilitary organizations, people involved with unlawful militias, people with extremist views. We saw in some cases election officials, you know, people leaving because of threats, and the people coming in having very extreme views. This is a very decentralized, localized effort. We saw the efforts to recruit poll workers from the Proud Boys and from militia groups, et cetera. That is harder to combat because it's not at a national level, right? It's a multi-headed hydra, and so it takes a lot of effort. And you know, this is where things get dangerous when you have sheriffs who call themselves constitutional sheriffs in local jurisdictions saying, we have all the power, even more power than the federal government in our jurisdiction, and we're going to start investigating election fraud. We're going to start having task forces to actually get involved in election administration. I mean, there are red lines there in the law. Most county sheriffs don't have that kind of authority, at least not to involve themselves in election administration. It's another thing that States United and ICAP have put guidance out about, and it's something that all of you who work in the election administration area need to know, work with your lawyers at the state level, at the district level, to figure out what are the boundaries of what sheriffs can do, and let's be ready if one tries to overreach and take some action against that.
Thank you. So I'll be brief, because I think we're running over time. But Mary gave a really wonderful synopsis of the Moore v. Harper case going before the Supreme Court tomorrow. We're going to have a full panel on that at 3:30, so stick around. It's our final panel of the day, going to be with my colleague Michael Thorning, who's an expert on this, among other phenomenal people. So please stay. We have lots of caffeine for you between now and then. But briefly, I think that you know, we have a real opportunity here. I think we were all prepared to be kind of like you know, staying vigilant on this election if it was widely contested. But because we were able to breathe a slight sigh of relief, we have some time to plan ahead, to close the gaps in our state and federal policy that allowed some of these things to happen. So we can, you know, pass legislation that prevents insider threats, like Colorado has really led the way on. We can increase resources for state and local election administration, and we can, you know, amend federal law to prevent another January 6th from happening. We have the Electoral Count Reform Act that we're hoping Congress will act on during the lame duck session. So there's lots of opportunity. And I think our hope bringing everyone here today was that we could start that conversation to think about what the midterms mean for us as a field, and how we can coordinate in 2023 on this kind of new and unsteady ground to make sure that we're as strong as possible going into 2024. So I hope we continue to have that conversation, and thank you all for coming today.
Awesome. Well, super brief. We're in a ship riding waves in a stormy time. Election officials are the ballast. The measure to watch over the next 2 years is whether they continue to bail out the ship from below the waterline, even as we're watching the wind swirl above, or not, okay? If they bail out, we lose hardened vets working off muscle memory with 4 years of like invaluable experience. If they leave, our infrastructure isn't built to replace them, okay? We don't train the way we need to, we don't reinforce. We're not leaving them with standard operating procedures inside of their offices. People come in, are handed the keys to an office, and we rely on their good faith. So that's the measure that I would be watching over the next couple of years to tell us how safe and secure and strong our democracy is going into 24.
So maybe I'll leave us with this as a parting thought. 2022 was fertile ground for us in terms of learning what worked. 2022 was also a fertile learning ground for bad actors to learn what they can get away with in 2024. Lots of learning has happened at the local level, which is what I think many of our speakers alluded to here, about things they could try and that they're going to come back in full force with in 2024. So I would leave us with that, which is that we have to be ever vigilant in this fight to preserve our election security as a component of democracy. Thank you so much, and thanks to this terrific panel for joining us today.